This is it, is the last one. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky angle where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today, it's time for Jean-Michel Jarre's Téo Téa. Right, we've made it to the last one. The last Jarre album I have a proper video in me, at least before the odds and ends video and the countdown thing. And I knew already this was gonna be a weird place to finish. Unless you're watching this via the playlist of all my Jarre reviews, in which case right after this you'll be zipped back in time to see 2015 me talking about who's this Laurie Anderson person, never heard of her. But whatever, we're finishing this series now. So for a little background on this album, which back when I first started this channel was the most recent thing Jarre had done. And I'm fairly certain the general consensus on it is that it was pretty bad. Well, I guess it does have its fans, but I don't think there's anyone out there who thinks this album is his best work. And I see plenty of people who regard it as a complete disaster. See, I think Jarre designed this album in hopes of catching up with the contemporary EDM scene at the time, because there's a lot of material here that is not characteristic of the man at all. And it very much seems like a push for him to, you know, fit in with the younger crowd. And the backpedaling afterwards certainly doesn't help matters, hoo boy. Jarre himself had this to say on the album, to directly quote him, "This album was a mistake, a dumb thing to do. I had a lot of personal problems at the time and kept myself entertained playing with these samples. And then they were released as an album, but when I listen to the album today, well, one has to stand behind one's own work, I guess, but I really wouldn't do it again." Yikes. And you'll also note this album is not on Spotify or iTunes or any of the usual places either. Even though I know it used to be. I'm fairly certain I bought this album on iTunes back in the day. Because it really seems like even the man himself finds it to be an embarrassing misstep. And as for me personally, all I can say is, I mean, I get why it gets this reaction, but come on guys, it's not that bad. Honestly, I think this album's pretty solid, all things considered. Sure, the ideas behind it are among the cheesiest Jarre's ever come up with, often reading a bit like, "How do you do, fellow kids?" But I still think Jarre at least had the music to back it up. It's not a smart album, and I'll admit it's not the most amazing thing Jarre ever did, but I still think it's a fun and enjoyable experience at the very least. It is not at all the complete train wreck that some people have made it out to be. Anyway, going down track by track, I'll admit when you go into it in the beginning, it is pretty off-putting, because the first two tracks are this sort of bright and poppy French house, Eurodance type stuff that sound absolutely nothing like Jarre. Like, it opens with Fresh News, which is this super happy EDM thing with really slick, danceable, and contemporary production, even has some horn blares to accompany it. And, while I will admit I actually really like the way this track sounds, it's the kind of opener that if I didn't know any better, it would have made me look at my iPod and made me wonder, do I even have the right album? And the title track doesn't help much either. I suppose this track sets up the concept of the album being about a group of men and women entering into a biosphere and self-sustained environment and the titular characters falling in love or something. And there's even like a weird video game-like music video to go alongside it. The track itself is again super contemporary, some really up-tempo French house stuff. Feels like maybe Jarre was taking a bit of influence from someone like David Guetta. That's pretty nightmarish on paper, I'll admit. Even if I think the song turned out to be perfectly fine. So far we're 2 tracks into this album and we don't have the slightest hint that we're listening to Jean-Michel Jarre. And we have this weird overarching concept introduced that doesn't really sound like the kind of thing he'd do either. Well, I suppose it's not that out of the question for him to do. Like, I mean, we just came out of Geometry of Love, the themes and ideas of which were in the same general ballpark as this, if not the sonic execution. Look up what that album cover actually depicts, by the way, and you'll know what I mean by that. And on that topic, let's talk about the next track, Beautiful Agony. Maybe the first moment on this album that you might be able to recognize is Jarre. Because, I mean, the chord progression on that one is very, you know, classical inspired and everything. It sounds exactly like the kind of thing he would have come up with. Only problem is that it kinda also has his then wife making what sounds like orgasm sounds. Which, okay? I really don't think something that sounds like a modern DJ remixing a Jarre track was the right backdrop for sex noises. I mean, love to love you, baby, this ain't. Thank you very much. So yeah, that's the first 3 tracks on this album, the kind of thing that will make you wonder what the fuck are you listening to? But I will at least say this, after this point the album does definitely start to really pick up for me. The next 4 tracks are all really solid. You have the repetitive but quite atmospheric Touch to Remember, based around a set of string patterns that sound really nice, a slow-moving but satisfying beat that you can easily imagine a crowd clapping along to. And of course a speak and spell voice talking about love in the most speak and spell way, naming out letters I-M-U-R, touch to remember, R-U-N, angel. Very simplistic stuff, but it's the kind of thing that, you know, not only surfaces this whole love concept in the way that doesn't come off kind of awkward once you remember it's coming from a guy in his late 50s, it's also kind of catchy and still really well produced stuff. Okay, Do It Fast, meanwhile, is a frantic drum and bass influenced, almost soundtrack-y piece that comes off rather laid back in spite of its super fast tempo. And then come my personal favorite tracks in the bunch with Partners in Crime 1 and 2, which sound like some theme song to a cheesy TV show about secret agents. And I freaking love the way it sounds. The first part being a lot more soundtracky with lots of with lots of mysterious orchestral string sounds. Banging Chemical Brothers-y beats and that iconic guitar sound that you'd associate with that kind of James Bond theme. And the second part's a bit more electronic heavy as well, even if this 2-part track is totally playing towards my personal love for that kind of old school TV theme sound, and otherwise follows cliches of that kind of music. I gotta say, this was easily the highlight of the album for me, and they're the tracks from this album that brought me in for the most repeat listens ever since I first heard it. I will admit, it's also not super characteristic of Jarre, but yeah, I'm totally a sucker for this kind of thing. After this, the album kinda gets a little spotty. Never totally strays from the love and human connection theme, which I think came together pretty alright in spite of all the different sounds on here. But the tracks themselves, after that, I'll admit, are a bit of a mixed bag. Chatterbox is a return to the contemporary EDM styles that we started out the album with. While I do like the bleeping melodies here, I don't think they're quite as fun as the first 2 tracks on here. In the Mood for You is a more laid-back, down-tempo thing, is probably the most Jean-Michel Jarre-sounding thing on the album, right down to his characteristic Oxygen-style bleeping and blooping washes in the back half. The quirky lead synth sounds on this one didn't do much for me, and the track's a little on the forgettable side, though I do also like the romantic string pads that take up big parts of this track. Gossip is kind of a filler track that fleshes out the concept, but isn't really that fun out of context. It's kind of this weird, clunky bass synth and a bunch of whispering in the background. I don't typically skip it, given how short and inconsequential it is, but I never choose to listen to it all by itself. Vintage, though, is a fun track, kinda like if you took the title track from this album and combined it with some of Jarre's happier themes in the past, like Fourth Rendezvous or Chronology 4 or Give Me a Sign. One of the better tracks on here for me. But then it's followed up by the least satisfying and most tedious track in the bunch, Melancholic Rodeo. Never mind the GarageBand stock taper winding effects that starts the track out, the high-pitched buzzing bass line just completely ruins this track for me. It's like something out of Michael Menard's first album, but far worse than anything on there. The guitar solos and synth pads are okay, I guess, but it's not enough. The track is just an unpleasant slog for me. One of Jarre's hardest to listen to tracks ever. But the album finally ends in an extended version of the title track, Téo Téa 4 o'clock AM. Ordinarily, I'd question the decision to include 2 versions of the same track on this album, but honestly I don't mind the reprisal here, I think it works. And I think this longer version is even a big improvement from the radio edit-sized original version. Just letting these grooves take up all the time they need for me to fully get into them. It feels like a fitting closer to this album, and even though we already know the track at this point, it feels like we're being brought full circle. It makes the track a bigger standout for me. So that's every track on Téo Téa, and yeah, I at least get why a lot of people didn't like this album. Jarre's stab at this more contemporary sound doesn't come off as him implementing the latest technology into his usual sound and embracing the now and looking into the future. It instead comes off a bit on the trendy side, like Jarre's trying to fit in with the crowd of French house artists in 2007, and following in the footsteps of his former co-producer Joachim Garraud, who is now really getting into making big radio hits with David Guetta. It's not a good look for Jarre, especially given his image of this veteran electronic music pioneer, but I still think this album completely smokes something like David Guetta's Pop Life from that same year. That album might better represent the trends of the time than this did, but that album's boring as shit and sounds pretty ass too. This is so much livelier, has so many more interesting ideas and better hooks, even has a concept tying it all together that I think came together decently well. I feel like if this hadn't come from Jean-Michel Jarre, I don't think it would have been nearly as badly received as it was. Let's be real, Guetta can only dream of making an album this good. So yeah, I definitely have my problems with Téo Téa, and I understand the hate for it, but I still don't think it deserves said hate. The sound, while trendy for the time, is at least fun and well executed. The hooks and melodies are still on point, and even if there are some occasional cringeworthy moments and duds on here, I still think there was more effort put into how it all came together as a whole than this kind of thing really needed. I just don't think it ought to be taken that seriously. I mean, Jarre has definitely made silly and cheesy albums in the past. If he can lean into an old single of his that goes tit, 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 I don't see why he should be embarrassed by this. This album is cheesy as hell, sure, but Jarre has proven to be capable of pulling off cheesy albums and songs before while still making them fun. And the cheesiness of this album is just a part of the fun for me here, too. I don't know, overall I think Téo Téa is a pretty underrated entry into the Jarre catalog, all things considered. One I still see myself coming back to in the future every now and then, and maybe deserves a second chance from people. I really don't think it's that bad at all. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, it's just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people, but if you want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.